You're in the land of ancient Egypt. A golden evening light falls on a solemn procession making its way to the west bank of the Nile. It is the land of the setting sun, the land of the dead. At the heart of this procession is a coffin, richly decorated, containing someone who has died. Flanking it are women draped in linen, their hair loose and bodies smeared with Nile mud as they wail in mourning. Priests burn incense and sprinkle milk along the path. Two women impersonating the goddesses Isis and Nephthys and the divine mourners of Osiris cling near the coffin, embodying grief and protection. Behind follow servants, carrying jars of beer, baskets of bread, personal belongings, and even furniture, all to be buried with the deceased. This is not merely a funeral. It is the beginning of a voyage to eternity. Why devote such care, ritual, and treasure to such an event? Well, for the Egyptians, it was important. And today, we're going to explore that fascinating world of ancient Egyptian funerary practices. We'll talk about their religious and cultural beliefs, about death and the afterlife, the intricate art of mummification, from the simplest burials to the legendary 70-day-long embalming processes of the great pharaohs, all the way to the solemn rituals and magical prayers performed, and the roles played by priests, embalmers, family members too, all coming together to prepare the dead. By the end of today's talk, I think you'll see that for the ancient Egyptians, preparing for death was as important as living itself. A grand drama in which every detail, from the color of amulets to the words of a spell, all mattered. So, we begin a very long video today, and with introductions out of the way, allow me to first welcome you. For those new to the channel, perhaps you don't know what to expect, but I hope you'll enjoy it. If you do enjoy it, click that like and subscribe button, and tell me what you think about ancient Egypt, how fascinating it all is in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. Thank you for those supporting on the Patreon and the merch store. Let us now get nice and comfortable, and we may begin. I had described somewhat of a vivid scene at the start. I hope it certainly set the stage for what is to come, but why bother with all of this? We need to understand why Egyptian funerals were the way they were, why they went to such lengths for the dead. At the core is a profound belief that death was not the end, but just a transition that everybody had to make, the great equalizer. Life continued on in another realm, and how one's remains and soul were treated determined on the quality of that eternal life. The Egyptians believed each person had multiple spiritual components, notably the Ka, the vital life force, or the essence, and the Ba, personality or soul. And at death, the Ba and Ka separated from the body. This would become the Kat. But they needed a preserved body, you see, to reunite, and form an Ak, an effective spirit. Now, as one text explains, the soul had to be able to recognize and return to the body to receive sustenance and continue its existence. Thus, preserving the corpse in a lifelike form was extremely important. The afterlife could only be achieved if the Ka had a physical home to return to. And immortality in ancient Egypt, that was conditional. One had to be mummified, properly buried, but you also had to be remembered by the living. If all these three were done, the deceased could live forever among the gods. But if not, the soul ran the risk of becoming restless, or even worse, non-existent, fading into the dust of the void. And this belief was so strong that even the fear of hauntings finds its way into Egyptian thought. If a person's funerary rites were neglected or their tomb desecrated, their Ba might return to torment the living, until finally this wrong was righted. In fact, many letters to the dead written by surviving relatives besieged deceased family members either to help or for peace from hauntings. Clearly ensuring the dead were properly cared for was viewed as essential both for the dead and the living. But where did all these ideas come from? They didn't appear out of thin air. Well, deep roots. We know ancient Egypt goes back a long, long way. Everyone knows that. Much of it stems from the old myths and stories of Osiris, the god who was murdered, but also resurrected. He became the lord of the underworld, and the first to be mummified, embalmed by the gods themselves. According to the story, the jackal-headed goddess Anubis helped wrap and revive him. Every deceased Egyptian was likened to Osiris. They hoped to follow in his footsteps, you see, to die, be restored, and live eternally. Indeed, the most expensive method of embalming was said to be, quote, the method of him whose name must not be spoken, a veiled reference to Osiris. Certainly shows with the amount of reverence and how sacred this process was held. Now, you'll hear the word duat quite a lot. That is kind of the afterlife, the next world. So the Egyptians envisioned the afterlife, or the duat, as a paradise called the Field of Reeds, a mirror of one's life in Egypt, but perfected. Fields of plenty, no hardship, perfect weather, no mosquitoes, all that sort of thing. All of the best things about life, but just put in technicolor. The bad things, they're all gone. It sounds pretty good. Of course, entry is not automatic. The soul had to face judgment in the hall of Ma'at, truth. In vivid imagination, the deceased stood before Osiris's tribunal. Their heart, which they saw as a seat of mind and mortality, was weighed on a great scale against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and divine order. If one had lived a balanced and just life, well, the heart would be lighter or equal in weight to the feather. Good news. The deceased would be justified, often called ma-keru, meaning true of voice. But if burdened by evil, the heart would tip the scales and be devoured, and that soul's journey has come to an unceremonious end. To accompany this trial, the Egyptians provided the dead with spells and prayers. Chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead contains the famous negative confession, a list of 42 sins the soul declares it has not committed. It says, I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not, etc. Pretty much goes on for a while, concluding with the emphatic statement, I am pure. One papyrus portrays the deceased pleading, may my heart be not silent in the judgment hall, hoping for a favorable verdict. These moral declarations were not just ritual. They reflect an Egyptian ethical code in life, guided by Ma'at. In essence, the promise of a blissful eternity encouraged Egyptians to live justly and maintain harmony on earth. It's a deal you have to make with those gods above. Just be good, and you'll get rewarded when the time comes. But to reach this hopeful afterlife, the physical body had to be preserved in the mortal realm. It was important to keep the corpse as lifelike as possible. Early in their history, Egyptians noticed that bodies buried directly in the hot, dry desert naturally became desiccated and did not decay. So some of the history's earliest mummies, like the famous Gebelein man, were actually created by accident, dried out by that desert environment. What a coincidence. It's certainly a good way to find out how to do things. Trial and error. Of course, this is likely what inspired the intentional preservation in the first place. By around 2600 BC, during Egypt's Old Kingdom, they began deliberately to mummify their dead. This was at first a privilege of pharaohs and elites, but over time the afterlife became a lot more democratized. Still, preserving a body, that was expensive, so the quality of mummification one received often depended on their means. The best mummies, ironically the ones that look most alive, tend to be royalty or nobility from the New Kingdom period, such as Tutankhamun and Seti I, whose mummies are extraordinarily well preserved. Even after over 3,000 years, it really is a sight to behold, if you're into that. The cultural importance of all of this cannot be understated as well. Funerary practices permeated Egyptian culture. It was everywhere. People of all classes made at least modest preparations for death. Even if one could only afford a simple linen shroud and a shallow grave, they'd still prepare them the best they could. Pharaohs, on the other hand, often began planning their tombs and burial goods as soon as they took power. Dig your own grave and save. But this wasn't seen as morbid, not at all. Rather, an exercise in prudence. You see, life was transient. The tomb is eternal. In fact, they were often called the houses of eternity. One Middle Kingdom's official tomb inscription even advises the living, build yourself a trustworthy house for the hereafter, for one day all men are proprietors in the grave. The whole society shared a focus on ensuring this immortality. Tombs were built, inscriptions were carved, and rituals scripted in a way that collapses the boundary between life and death. An ancient Egyptian would say a deceased person has gone to their ka or gone west, rather than ceased to exist or died. There was no ceasing to exist. Well, unless you had really lazy family members. Let's hope not. Funerals, therefore, were not just farewells. They were carefully orchestrated launch ceremonies, sending a person from the realm of the living into the realm of the gods with all of the provisions and blessings necessary. Well, to sum all this up, the religious and cultural significance of funerals in Egypt, or just broadly funerary practices, anything within that sphere, was pretty immense. It was rooted in the belief that life, identity, and moral order continued after death, and the tomb was a gateway to the next world. The mummy was a vessel for the spirit, and the funerary ritual an absolute requirement to secure one's place among the blessed in eternity. And so with that worldview in mind, let's move on to how they actually prepared the body. The world-famous process, and such a quintessential Egyptian thing. Mummification. So, mummification. The goal was pretty straightforward. remove decay, and especially moisture, so the body would not rot and could effectively last forever. The execution, however, was anything but simple. This was a little bit of an art, and a little bit of a science. Of course, it combined that science, anatomical knowledge, and chemistry of preservation with religion too, rituals and spells. So, let's try and think of ourselves in that ancient embalmer's workshop and try and figure out how a mummy was made. The body of the deceased, once it had been washed and delivered to the embalmers, was taken to a special tent or structure called the Ibu, the place of purification, or the Wabet, the cleaning place. It was here that priests and professional embalmers worked as a team, performing their tasks according to strict ritual protocol. The chief embalmer typically wore a jackal-headed mask to represent Anubis. In fact, texts and paintings show an embalmer wearing an Anubis mask overseeing the work, a literal embodiment of the deity guiding the process. That was one of Anubis's responsibilities too, embalming. Now this chief would have assistants who were skilled in surgery and wrapping, as well as a lector priest who would read spells at each stage. The entire process famously took 70 days from start to finish, a period often mentioned in text and confirmed by Herodotus, a Greek historian who described Egyptian mummification in the 5th century BC. During these 70 days, various steps were completed methodically: cleansing, evisceration, drying, anointing, wrapping. So let's go through them. Now, step 1, that was purification and the removal of the brain. The first actual step in making a mummy was, of course, to remove those parts of the body that decayed fastest. The brain, which the Egyptians oddly did not regard as important, though they thought the heart was the seat of thinking, was removed through the nostrils. An embalmer would take a long metal hook, often a bronze or iron tool, and carefully push it up into the skull through the nasal passage to liquefy the brain and pull it out in pieces. Sounds pretty gruesome. Well, it was certainly delicate work. No one's denying that. It had to be done carefully to avoid disfiguring the face. The liquid brain matter would then be drained out. In many excavated skulls of mummies, resin or linen was later inserted into the cranial cavity. Interestingly, sometimes the brain was simply discarded since they didn't think it was vital. One ancient reporter even says embalmers just threw the brain away after extraction. And then we have step 2, evisceration, that is, removing the internal organs. Next, a slicer priest made an incision in the left side of the abdomen with a special knife. In ancient times, perhaps an obsidian or flint blade, described by Herodotus as an Ethiopian stone. Through this cut, they removed the organs of the thorax and abdomen. Stomach, intestines, liver, lungs were all taken out. The only major organ left inside the body was the heart, for reasons that we have noted. It was considered the core of one's being, and, well, you needed it once you had to do the weighing of the heart in the afterlife. In fact, embalmers took great care to leave the heart in place. If it was accidentally removed, they would sew it back or substitute a heart scarab amulet inscribed with a spell imploring the heart to not betray its owner in the judgment. I mean, I don't know if you'd get away with that in front of Osiris, but you could certainly try. It's better than showing up empty-handed, or empty-chested, I suppose. The other organs, however, were very important to preserve as well. Each organ was treated, dried, and stored in its own special container known as a canopic jar. By the New Kingdom, there were 4 canopic jars per body, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus, deities who protected the organs. For example, the human-headed god Imseti guarded the liver, Hapi, the baboon-headed one, the lungs, Duamutef, the stomach, and Keb-Senuf, the falcon-headed one, to guard the intestines. The jar's lids were often carved to represent these protective spirits. You can pretty much tell what's inside by just looking at what god's on there. Pretty interesting labeling system. These jars would be buried alongside the mummy in earlier periods, but in later periods, embalmers sometimes wrapped the organs and placed them inside the body cavity, yet they still included empty canopic jars in the tomb as tradition. And here's another interesting little detail, just to illustrate the length that the embalmers went to, as how they occasionally enhanced the corpse's appearance. What do you mean? Well, for example, the mummy of Pharaoh Ramesses IV in 12th century BCE was found with small onions inserted into his eyes to replace the eyes that had rotted away. This unique case in mummification shows an attempt to make the face look more lifelike by giving some fullness behind the eyelids. The nostrils of the same mummy were plugged with linen and peppercorns, perhaps to maintain the shape of the nose. These careful touches speak to the Egyptian desire to preserve the body as it did in life, since the Ka, of course, had to recognize it. Now, step 3, desiccation. With the organs removed, the body and the organs with the organs removed, the body and the organs separately needed to be dried out thoroughly. And to do this, the Egyptians achieved this by using a naturally occurring salt mixture called natron, a combination of sodium carbonate, bicarbonate, and chlorine found in Egyptian salt lakes. The corpse was covered entirely in natron crystals, or packed in natron powder for a period of many days. Classical sources and modern experiments confirm 40 days was the key period for drying, though the total process was 70. Either way, about 40 days in natron, all moisture had been leached out of the tissues. The body would be much thinner, skin shrunken and darkened, essentially mummified. The internal organs, then removed, were likewise packed in natron to dry. Sometimes embalmers also placed packets of natron inside the body cavity and even beneath the skin. This dehydration step was the most critical for preservation. Herodotus emphasized that they were not allowed to exceed 70 days of natron. Quote, "For a longer time than this, it is not permitted." Perhaps because over-drying could make the corpse too brittle. Well, after the set time, the body was washed of natron and any residual salts, and step 3 was all complete. Now step 4 was anointing, stuffing, and restoration. Once dried, the body was something like, how can I put it? It's like a big piece of beef jerky. Think of it like that, very shrunken and stiff. The embalmer's next job was to restore a lifelike shape and impart pleasant aromas associated with sanctity and divinity. They would anoint the skin with oils, resins, and spices. According to Herodotus, the embalmers filled up the body cavity with pure myrrh, cassia, and other spices before sewing it back up. They also liberally applied cedar oil, frankincense, and beeswax in various stages. These substances were antimicrobial, i.e., they helped in preservation, and also gave the mummy the characteristics sweet scent often noted by archaeologists, even thousands of years later. In some mummies, the body cavity was packed with linen, sawdust, or sand plump to thicken up those sunken areas. For instance, after about 40 days of drying, embalmers might stuff linen pads under the skin or inside the abdomen to restore a fuller shape. On occasion, artificial eyes, like the onions we mentioned, or stone eyes, were placed, and a facial feature could be subtly padded out. The whole aim was to make the mummy look whole and a little more dignified. One scholar poetically noted that the mummification at this stage was much more of an art than it is a science. Quote, transforming a corpse into a godlike form. Indeed, the word mummy in Egyptian, sa, also meant noble, dignified, implying that being mummified elevated one's status among the dead. It is pretty fascinating to consider that the Egyptians also saw mummification as a kind of spiritual cleansing. The physical removal of organs could be linked to removing sins. They treated moral impurities as forms of decay to be excised. Embalmers cleansed the body physically, but the priests would simultaneously recite spells to cleanse it spiritually. The result was a purified, intact body, ready to house the spirit once more. So, step 5, wrapping. The final step was wrapping the body in the linen bandages, and this could be an incredibly elaborate procedure on its own, often taking many days of the total process. The embalmers used hundreds of yards of linen strips, often recycled linen from old clothes or household textiles. In fact, even Pharaoh's bandages have been found to bear laundry marks of palaces, believe it or not. Each finger or toe might be wrapped separately, arms and legs wrapped, then bound together. As they wound the linens, the priests, or lector readers, would chant spells from funerary texts to protect the body. At various stages in the wrapping, they inserted amulets between layers of linen, small charms like scarabs, the Eye of Horus, the Jed pillar, that symbol of stability, that is, and others each placed at a strategic point on the body with a prayer. For example, a heart scarab amulet was often placed over the heart, engraved with a spell from the Book of the Dead, usually spell 30b, entreating the heart not to weigh down the scales of judgment. Stone or faience wedjat, the Eye of Horus amulets, might be placed over an incision to magically heal it. Models of the opening of the mouth tools were included in the wrappings by the late period. The linen itself was coated in a warm resin or gum in intervals, acting like glue. This is why many mummies have a dark, shell-like exterior, by the way, because of this warm resin material. By the end, the body was entirely encased, from head to toe, often with a mummy mask or portrait over the head and a large shroud wrapped around everything. So when all this was done, the once lifeless, decaying corpse had been transformed into something new. The mummy, a package that Egyptians believed was now worthy of housing the person's soul forever. The final wrapped mummy often looked like a human-shaped bundle, sometimes decorated with painted eyes or inscriptions on the wrappings. Priests would place the mummy in a series of coffins, perhaps a painted wooden coffin which might go inside a larger sarcophagus. In some periods, the coffin was shaped and painted to resemble the person's living image. Think about Tutankhamun. So, of course, the car could identify it easily. But it has to be noted that not everybody got the full special treatment. The deluxe package was only for those who paid. Herodotus describes when a body was brought to an embalmer. They show the family wooden models of corpses, representing 3 price points. The most expensive first-class method that we just detailed, the second cheaper method, and a very basic third method. If the family chose the best method, the steps are as above. Brain out, organs out, spices, natron, wrapping. It's all pretty lavish. The second, more budget-friendly option, the embalmers did not cut the body open at all. Instead, they injected cedarwood oil into the body and sealed it for the natron period. The oil would dissolve all the organs into a liquid, which would then be drained out after some days, bringing out the melted guts with it, effectively emptying and preserving the body without surgery. This left only skin and bones, as the flesh would be partly dissolved too. The corpse, now much more skeletal, was returned to the family without the elaborate wrapping. Imagine having to go and pick that up. One imagines this second-class mummy was somewhat less presentable. And finally, the third and cheapest option, according to Herodotus, said it was simply to purge the intestines with a liquid, possibly a laxative enema, lay the body in natron for 70 days, and then hand it back. No special chemicals, no nice-smelling spices, no wrapping. Of course, this would result in a fairly basic desiccated corpse, likely just bundled up in a shroud. But for the poor, even this might have been too costly. Many common people in Egypt's long history were probably given simple burials in the desert sands without elaborate embalming, or were only partially mummified, perhaps just dried with natron and wrapped in old cloth. The embalmers had their own guilds too, by the way, and with guilds comes trade secrets. Herodotus notes that this profession was hereditary and highly specialized, and they even had taboos. For instance, Herodotus recounts a rather shocking precaution. Now believe this, when a beautiful woman or a high-status woman died, her body was not given to embalmers immediately. The family would wait 3 to 4 days before allowing the embalmers to have the corpse, in order, and this is what Herodotus says, that the embalmers may not abuse the woman. Now, where did they get this idea from? Well, apparently there was an incident with a embalmer doing something that he was not meant to be doing with a recently deceased woman. Not cool. Well, this story, lurid as it is, suggests that even the embalmers themselves were sometimes viewed with a mix of respect and also fear by ordinary Egyptians. They had tremendous power over the dead, and had to be trusted with not only one's loved ones, but with their hopes for eternity. Well, we can only hope that they caught that embalmer who was not acting in a professional manner, to say the least. I wonder what they did to him. Either way, by the end of the mummification process, the deceased was physically ready for burial. A preserved body in nested coffins, often with a funerary mask. The whole ensemble might include the mummy with amulets within, a mummy board or mask covering the face, an inner coffin, wooden, human-shaped and painted, perhaps one or more outer coffins, and a large stone sarcophagus to hold them all. For a pharaoh or a wealthy noble, this nesting would be pretty elaborate. Of course, the best example we have is Tutankhamun, and his mummy was actually within 3 coffins, a kind of Egyptian babushka doll, the innermost solid gold, the 2 outer wood gilded, plus a stone sarcophagus and 4 gilded wooden shrines around that. But for common people, they'd just be thrown in a box. Or even no coffin at all might suffice, just a burial shroud. With the body prepared, the next phase was equally as important. The funerary ritual and the burial itself, in which the dead would be animated, celebrated, and sent off with proper ceremony. Now, let's follow our mummy from the workshop to the tomb and observe the rituals performed. So, after 70 days of meticulous preparation, the day of the funeral is finally here. But the ancient Egyptian funeral was not a quick graveside service either. It was pretty complex a sequence of rituals, some carried out in the home of the deceased, some along the way to the tomb, and many at the site of the tomb itself. These rites were meant to magically reanimate the deceased's senses, protect them from harm, and officially send them into the afterlife with the blessings of the gods. Upon death, Egyptians entered this period of mourning. Family members and professional mourners would cry out and cover themselves in dust or mud. Herodotus describes how, when a respected household member died, the women would plaster their heads and faces with mud, leave the body inside the house, and run through the streets wailing with bared breasts, joined by female relatives. Now, take some things, Herodotus says, with a grain of salt, but, well, we don't have any sources saying that they don't do this. As for the men of the family, meanwhile, they would also beat their chests and mourn separately. This public display of grief announced the death to the community and honored the deceased with visible emotion. After this, the body was taken for mummification, as we have seen. So, on the appointed day of burial, often around the 70th day after death, when the mummification was complete, a funeral procession formed to escort the mummy to its tomb. Now, one can imagine the scene. The mummy in its coffin was placed on a funerary bier, or a sled often pulled by oxen or carried by men. Scenes from tomb art and texts, as well as, of course, Herodotus' account, depict a line of people making this journey. At the front typically were priests uttering prayers, burning incense. One priest might carry a brazier of incense and sprinkle libations like milk or water along the route. Close to the coffin, as mentioned, were two female mourners representing Isis and Nephthys. These women, sometimes actual family members, other times hired mourners, took on the roles of the two goddess sisters who mourned Osiris. They would gesture dramatically, throw dust on their hair, and chant laments just as Isis and Nephthys did for the Osiris of the legend and myth. Their presence was symbolic. It merged the deceased's story with that of Osiris, promising resurrection. Following them were other mourners and relatives, often with arms thrown in the air or on their heads in grief. Servants trudged along, carrying all the goods to be buried, jars of food and drink, furniture, chests of clothing, sharp figures, and so on. For a pharaoh's funeral, this would be a staggering convoy of treasures. Even for a well-off commoner, it might include a few of his favorite, stools and beds, offerings, a couple of tools, things like this. Also in the procession was the canopic chest, containing the 4 jars of organs, carried separately, like an honored item. Musicians might be present too. Some funerals employed flute players or singers of dirges. If the tomb was across the Nile, as was quite often in Thebes, the procession would include a boat journey. They would ferry the coffin across the river to the west bank, since most cemeteries were located in western deserts. This boat ride itself was symbolic of crossing into the afterlife. Arrival at the tomb and the opening of the mouth ceremony, that was next on the agenda. Once the procession reached the tomb entrance, there were further ceremonies. The coffin was met by dancers and a priest who recited spells in honor of the dead. The centerpiece of the tombside rituals was the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ritual, attested since the pyramid text of the Old Kingdom, was performed to restore the deceased's ability to see, hear, breathe, and eat in the afterlife. The idea was that mummification, while preserving the body, left the person in a deathly silence. The opening of the mouth would magically restore their senses. Well, how did the opening of the mouth actually play out? Kind of like this. The mummy, or sometimes statue of the deceased, was stood upright. Often the coffin was propped vertically, or the mummy taken out and sort of supported up. A priest, usually wearing a leopard skin robe, that being the priest, and sometimes an Anubis jackal mask too, would touch the face of the mummy with a special set of ritual tools. One tool was the adze, a small axe-like instrument. Another was a spoon-shaped blade called a peseshkef, possibly resembling the tool used in childbirth to cut the umbilical cord. The symbolism was that the deceased is being reborn into the afterlife, and these tools open the mouth as at birth. The priest would touch the mouth, eyes, ears with these instruments while reciting spells such as, "I have opened your mouth, I have opened your 2 ears, I have opened your mouth with the instruments of Anubis," a spoken confirmation that the senses are indeed restored. In fact, spell 23 of the Book of the Dead is explicitly the formula for the opening of the mouth. A line from one version reads, in one translation, "My mouth is opened by Ptah. The bonds of Seth which restrict my mouth have been loosened," invoking gods to free the deceased from silence of death. Now, the imagery of bonds being loosened implies that death's hold is being released so the person can function again normally, but now, instead of in the mortal world, in the spirit realm. Often as part of this ritual, a calf or ox was sacrificed. The leg of this sacrificial animal, the foreleg, was offered to the deceased, symbolically providing strength and life force. The offering of meat and blood spilled were also tied to revivification, possibly linked to the Osiris myth where the spilling of the blood or the energy of life is transferred. Now, during the opening of the mouth, the family, especially the heir or oldest son, might even participate. In some depictions, the son of the deceased holds the mummy and touches the mouth, effectively performing the ceremony under guidance of priests. In royal funerals, this could have political significance. Well, for example, when Tutankhamun was buried, it is believed that his successor, acting as a son figure, performed the opening of the mouth and thus legitimized himself as heir. Thus the ritual also publicly confirmed continuity, that the dead was properly installed in afterlife and the living successor had done their duties. After the opening of the mouth concluded, the now, reanimated deceased was presented with offerings. Tables heaped with bread, beer, beef, poultry, vegetables, wine, and incense would all be laid out. A priest or family member would present these and consecrate them with the traditional offering formula. An offering which the king gives and Anubis who is upon his mountain, that he may give invocation offerings of bread and beer, oxen and fowl, alabaster and linen, everything good and pure for the ka of whoever name. Now this offering formula appears on countless tombs. It's really everywhere. It indicates the supplies that the dead would enjoy. A little bit of a funeral shopping list. At the tomb, they likely recited such prayers and burned or deposited the goods. The 2 women playing Isis and Nephthys might perform a final mourning song at the tomb door, inviting the deceased to enter and rest in peace. According to descriptions, at this point, the deceased was placed inside the tomb, and the footsteps of those who had been inside were swept away. And this is an interesting detail. They literally would sweep away the footprints, perhaps to symbolically remove any traces of the living in the realm of the dead, no intruders, and to ritually seal the tomb as pure. Once the mummy and goods were arranged in the burial chamber, the tomb was sealed. Often a stone door or blocking masonry was put in place. The Egyptians would then say that the deceased has gone to his ka, But the ceremony wasn't quite over for the participants. After the burial, the mourners and the families often held a funerary banquet nearby, a feast in honor of the deceased. Imagine, after all the somber rites, they now share food and drink, some of which may have been offered symbolically to the dead first. Tomb paintings show scenes of such banquets, relatives eating, drinking wine, musicians playing harps, dancers performing in honor of the dead. This was a social and religious function. It celebrated the dead person's transition and also reinforced family and community bonds among the living. Texts even suggest that the spirit of the deceased was believed to attend this feast in a spiritual form, enjoying the company one last time before departing fully to the west. In one tomb painting, guests are actually shown sniffing lotus flowers and making merry, perhaps a reminder that death to the Egyptians was a natural part of life's cycle and not an occasion for unending gloom. So they mourned, sincerely, but also celebrated the belief that the deceased would live on in paradise. With the dead person interred, there were ongoing rituals beyond the funeral day. The tomb would ideally have a chapel or offering place where a family could bring regular offerings daily, or on special feast days like the Feast of Osiris or the Wag Festival for the Dead. Priests or relatives would continue to perform the opening of the mouth on statues of the deceased in the chapel, enabling those statues to receive offerings as stand-ins for the real person. Tombs often had a false door carved in the wall of the chapel, a niche through which the spirit was believed to come out and take the offerings left by the living. The false door was like a magical portal of sorts, inscribed with the deceased's name and titles, and often the offering formula. It was expected that forevermore the car of the deceased would be able to emerge and eat the essence of the bread and beer offered, ensuring it never went hungry. After all, eternity is a long time. But there were also periodic ceremonies. For kings, large-scale rituals at their mortuary temples. For commoners, families might observe a 40-day memorial service, since that 40 days was significant in the embalming, or an annual remembrance on the anniversary of death. The living sometimes wrote letters to the dead on papyrus or on bowls left in the tomb chapel, asking their deceased relatives for help with problems, or sometimes even to intervene in family disputes. In fact, all of this just shows how the dead were considered active members of the family, still having a stake in the world of the living. So to sum it all up, the Egyptian funerary ritual was a very well choreographed affair. It began with a heartfelt mourning and ended up with an almost uplifting banquet, with the critical magical rite, opening of the mouth, in between to ensure the mummy was activated for the afterlife. The entire sequence reflects their approach to death, deeply respectful, very ritualistic, but also quite optimistic. They truly believed that these ceremonies had power, that saying the right spells and performing the right actions would allow the deceased to breathe once more, to even speak before the gods and safely navigate into the afterlife. Now, who carried out all these tasks? Let's examine the roles of those involved, the priests, the embalmers, the family members in more detail. Oh, we're not even halfway through this video. I told you it was going to be a long one. An ancient Egyptian funeral was a community event. It mobilized people with various skills, of course. Priests and professionals handled the technical and ritual aspects, while the family of the deceased also played their own roles in mourning and part in certain rites and rituals. Now, this cooperative effort ensured that both the religious requirements and the personal wishes were fulfilled. So let's break down a little bit who did what Let's start with the embalmers. These were the technicians of mummification. As we saw, there were specialists who inherited their craft, often called embalmers, preparers of the corpse, or sometimes simply just called priests. That job was semi-sacred, I suppose. They worked in facilities, often near the necropolis. Necropolis, of course, being the Greek term for a city of the dead, necro, dead, polis, city. The chief embalmer, wearing the mask of Anubis, led the process. He might also be a priest of Anubis. In fact, one title in the inscriptions was Heri Seshta, meaning the chief of secrets, which is referred to as the chief embalmer, hinting at secret knowledge of preservation. The embalmers were responsible for the entire 70-day procedure, removing organs, drying the body, anointing, wrapping. They also crafted or obtained the materials that were needed. The oils, resins, linen, the amulets and coffins, often in cooperation with the artisans. And they likely recited, or at least listened to certain spells during their work. Some embalming rituals are preserved in texts like the Ritual of Embalming. However, usually a separate priest, the lector priest, was presented to read from scrolls while embalmers did the manual task. One can imagine the chief embalmer as somebody akin to a master surgeon plus mortician plus priest. It's a triple class. And yes, as Herodotus relates, they even had a bit of a mercantile side, negotiating fees with the family for different levels of service. Despite dealing with death daily, the role was very much honored. They were seen as facilitators of immortality. Of course, then we have the priests at the funeral. Multiple of them took part in the funeral ceremonies. The most important was the Sem priest, often identifiable by the aforementioned leopard skin cloak, worn over a white robe. The Sem priest was in charge of leading rituals like the opening of the mouth and made offerings. In iconography, sometimes shown with a short, shaved haircut, except for a side lock. Sometimes the Sem is the son of the deceased. Another was the lector priest, called the Keri Heb, who carried a scroll and intoned the necessary liturgies and spells at each stage, for example, reciting the words of the opening of the mouth ritual. The lector priest had to have much funerary liturgy memorized or accessible, and he essentially conducted the ceremony by cueing the actions with spoken words. There was also a priest specifically in charge of incense and libations, often seen with a censer or water pot purifying the ground and participants. One priest might don the role of Anubis with the mask during the final ceremony at the tomb to physically support the mummy upright. In royal funerals, a high priest or even the vizier might appear to officiate, since burying a pharaoh was a state occasion. But of course, we're talking about the high end for that. For commoners, local priests from the nearest temple or those attached to the necropolis itself would be hired to do the job. And then, of course, the deceased family, they were not passive either. The closest relatives, usually the eldest son or daughter, had responsibilities of their own. In many depictions, the elder son acts as the chief mourner. Alongside a female relative, they may assist in the opening of the mouth ceremony by holding the mummy or touching it with tools, signifying their duty to send off their parent. The family, of course, bankrolled the funeral according to their ability, and thus determined how grand it would be. Tomb preparation, in particular, often consumed a large portion of one's life savings. During the procession, family members are the primary mourners. It was considered a sacred obligation to weep and wail for the deceased. Not doing so would be a sign of disrespect. Two women in the role of Isis and Nephthys, as noted, might be actual relatives like the wife and sister of the deceased. Kind of like how you have a flower girl or a best man at a wedding, this kind of thing. But if you couldn't find someone, or you didn't have any sisters or some other situation, you could hire women adept at ritual lamentation. Professional mourners, I suppose, cosplaying as Isis or Nephthys. Interestingly, ancient tomb inscriptions sometimes name the two kites, and that is kite, as in a bird of prey associated with Isis and Nephthys who perform the mourning. These could be titles for professional mourners. But in some cases, a wife or mother took on the aspect of Isis herself in mourning her loved one. The presence of family in these roles personalized the rites. It was not just professionals, but blood relations, ensuring the deceased soul had every advantage. And so after burial, the family, especially the male heirs, had the ongoing duty of making offerings at the tomb, or maintaining the mortuary cult. In the Old Kingdom in particular, nobles often had a line in their tomb autobiographies asking their descendants to remember them and to recite the offering formulas on their behalf. For kings, their family, quote-unquote, which in this case included their successors and state-appointed priests, maintained elaborate offering rituals at mortuary temples. For private individuals, their children might bring bread, beer, or incense to the tomb on festivals. If a family died out or neglected the tomb, it was thought that the deceased could suffer hunger or even just loneliness, and no one likes to be lonely. This is one reason why Egyptians were motivated to have sons, by the way, to secure someone to tend their tomb in perpetuity. In cases where no relative could do it, people endowed funds to pay priests to perform offerings, a little bit like a perpetual trust fund, but instead of money for prayers. And we should also mention those who prepared the funerary goods. We can't forget them, that's for sure. We have sculptors, coffin makers, painters, jewelers, scribes. These individuals contributed indirectly, of course, but were all a vital part of the process, part of the broader structure. A scribe might carefully copy spells from the Book of the Dead onto a papyrus to be buried with the deceased. Artisans would decorate coffins with protective deities and texts. Those lovely tomb walls covered in paintings of the afterlife? They would have been done by artists from the village of Deir el-Medina. For example, they painted them in the New Kingdom. Even the tomb diggers and builders, skilled masons and laborers, they played a crucial part long before the actual funeral day by constructing the house in which the funeral would culminate. We have direct evidence of that, too, during the New Kingdom. A whole community of tomb builders near Deir el-Medina took pride in building and decorating the pharaoh's tomb, knowing that it was key to the king's eternity. They were so dedicated that they once went on strike when rations failed to arrive, refusing to work on the royal tomb until they were paid in grain. Fair enough. This incident in 1158 BC under Ramesses III is actually the first recorded labor strike in history, caused because the workers who built tombs, including the pharaohs, had not received their promised remuneration. The fact that the vizier had to release emergency grain from the temple reserves to pay them shows how important their work was to the state, and how seriously even the government took the business of proper burial. Now, after the burial, certain priests called Ka priests, or servants of the Ka, took over the responsibility of making offerings at the tomb regularly. Wealthy individuals might hire or endow positions for priests to bring offerings every day or on a feast schedule. For kings, entire mortuary temples staffed by dozens of priests ensured the pharaoh's spirit was fed and honored daily. In the pyramid complexes of the Old Kingdom, or the mortuary temples on the Theban West Bank in the New Kingdom, these priests kept the memory of the deceased alive in the living world, which was essential because Egyptians believed the soul needed to be remembered to continue to exist. As long as people, in particular priests, recited your name and offerings, as long as they remembered you, you weren't truly dead. That's pretty much it. Your soul would live on in perpetuity. But it is also worth noting the role of necropolis police, or guards if we're going to use a less cool name, particularly by the New Kingdom. The problem of tomb robbery was pretty widespread, and especially in those periods of chaos. You'll see that in between the Egyptian dynasties, when things tend to fall apart, that there is that, chaotic little period between drinks that, people don't really follow the rules. So, there were officials assigned to guard tombs and inspect them regularly. Some tomb workers themselves doubled as guards. A papyrus from the New Kingdom, Papyrus Abbot it is called, records the officials checking royal tombs for signs of robbery, indicating an administrative role in protecting the dead. This shows that caring for the dead wasn't just a one-day affair, but certainly a continuous duty that even involved a kind of law enforcement. Well, to sum it up, an Egyptian funeral engaged a whole network of people: the embalmers, the priests, the family members, the craftsmen, and later the priests or officials that maintained the tomb and cult. Each had their own defined functions, but they all worked towards that single purpose: to give the dead a proper send-off into eternity. And with the body prepared, the rituals completed, and everybody having done their part, the deceased was now ready to journey to the afterlife. But to navigate that journey, knowledge was power. And this brings us to the very rich literary and magical tradition of funerary texts that the Egyptians developed as guides and protections for the dead. So, imagine being an Egyptian soul who has just left the body and entered the mysterious realm of the Duat. How would you know where to go? How would you know how to overcome the obstacles, solve little puzzles, and present yourself to the gods? It's pretty complicated, and you don't want to make any faux pas, that's for sure. And the Egyptians had an answer for it all. Don't worry. The texts, the spells, the prayers, the hymns written all over the tomb walls, and the coffins, and the papyri. It was hard to miss. They served as both a travel guide to the other world, and also a toolbox of magic for the deceased. Pretty cool, huh? Over the centuries, they compiled a formidable corpus of such literature, the most famous, of course, which is nicknamed the Book of the Dead, but, of course, actually called the Book of the Coming Forth by Day. But that was the later versions. Before the Book of the Dead, there were earlier collections, the pyramid texts and coffin texts. These writings give us an incredible insight into Egyptian beliefs and theology. They're a mix of ritual, magic, and poetry, and they were as essential a part of an elite burial as the mummy or the coffin. So let's look at each in turn. First, we'll start with the pyramid texts. This takes us all the way back to the Old Kingdom, between 24 and 2300 BC. These are the oldest known religious texts from ancient Egypt, and indeed among the oldest in the world. Of course, that's a hotly debated topic, which one is the oldest. They were carved in the interior walls of certain Old Kingdom royal pyramids, hence the name. The practice began towards the end of the 5th dynasty. famously in the pyramid of King Unas at Saqqara, is around 2350, and continued in the pyramids of pharaohs and some queens into the 6th dynasty. The pyramid texts are a collection of hundreds of utterances or spells, sometimes just numbered, around 759 in total across all the pyramids. They were unillustrated, just columns of hieroglyphic text, and were meant exclusively for the use of the king and perhaps a few queens. At this early period, commoners did not get these texts. The content is pretty diverse too. Hymns to gods, magical formulas to help the king ascend to the sky, addresses to the corpse, and dialogues where the king asserts his place among the gods. A frequent theme is the pharaoh joining Osiris in the underworld, or rising to the heavens to sail with Ra, the sun god. The spells are inscribed in a specific arrangement around the burial chamber and antechamber, almost as a ritual landscape on the walls. One famous utterance from the pyramid texts, that is utterance 213 in Unas's pyramid, proclaims to the dead king, "O King Unas, you have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive." It's a pretty bold statement, isn't it? It's a powerful assurance that the king lives on, just in a different form. It continues, "Sit upon the throne of Osiris, your scepter in your hand, that you may give orders to the living." The text basically transforms the dead monarch into a god-king in the next world, ruling alongside Osiris. Other utterances were meant to open the tomb or protect the body, for instance, spells to prevent decay or to release the king's shackles abound. The pyramid text also contained the earliest version of the myth of Osiris embedded into them, and the notion that the king's resurrection is parallel to Osiris's. While reserved for loyalty, the pyramid texts certainly set the stage for all funerary literature in later times. They show the importance of spoken words in magically effectuating the resurrection. The mere presence of carved spells in the tomb was presumably enough for them to take effect. Some might have been recited at the funeral as well, but we can't know that for sure, but it certainly seems most likely that they would be. Now, then we get a couple hundred years later, between 2100 and 1600 BC. That's the Middle Kingdom. We find the Coffin texts. As time went on, the privilege of the afterlife and the knowledge to attain it was finally democratized somewhat, extended beyond kings. In the Middle Kingdom, high officials and other elites wanted similar spells for themselves, because after all, everybody was going to the duat eventually. Thus, coffin texts emerged. People must have gone crazy when they released that one. So called because these spells were often painted or inscribed on the inside of coffins, that is, the coffins of non-royal persons. In a sense, they're basically a free-for-all expanded version of the pyramid texts. They incorporate many of the old pyramid text spells too, adapted to refer to the deceased rather than specifically to the king, and they also add a few new ones. The coffin text could also appear on the tomb walls or papyri of the period, but coffins were the primary medium. Now, an upper-class Egyptian could be buried with a wooden coffin that literally surrounded their corpse with magical writings. It certainly makes you feel a lot better about going to the grave. These texts seem to deal with similar themes: protecting the body, guiding the soul through obstacles, providing the transformation spells to allow the deceased to take different forms. There are spells, in fact, to turn into a falcon or a lotus flower to travel freely. The key difference is the coffin text introduced the idea of detailed guides to underworld geography. One text, often called Spell 110, the coffin text spells are numbered in Egyptology, by the way, is known as the Book of Two Ways. It's kind of like a map of the afterlife drawn on the coffin bottom, showing two paths one can take to reach Osiris's realm, complete with illustrations and a lake of fire, etc. And so we see vignettes, little illustrations first appearing in the coffin text spells. And these might be the ancestor of the later illustrated Book of the Dead vignettes. The coffin texts show a continuing concern with the ka and the ba, explicitly focusing on how to release the ba from the body and then reunite it with the ka. One coffin text spell is for not letting the ba be imprisoned in the tomb, implying that they wanted the soul to be free to come and go, but also to return to the body for sustenance. In terms of availability, by the New Kingdom, around 2000 BC, wealthy commoners, not just pharaohs, could have these spells. This reflects a theological shift. The afterlife is theoretically open to all, but you still had to get proper burial, though. They couldn't just throw you into the ground. But the king is no longer the only one with a map. Everyone in his court might get one too, albeit the quality of the coffin and the extent of the text is still dependent upon wealth, but hey, it's a step in the right direction. And then, of course, we get to the famous Book of the Dead. Now, that is in the New Kingdom and later. New Kingdom basically starting around 1550 and going up to about 30 BCE. Points if you can tell me in the comments what happened in 30 BCE. This is the most famous collection. Often what people imagine when thinking of Egyptian funerary magic. It is the go-to, the quintessential. Not the OG, but certainly the most popular. Now that term, Book of the Dead, is somewhat of a misnomer created by early Egyptologists. The Egyptians called it the Book of Going Forth by Day, or simply the spell for going out in the daytime, emphasizing the deceased's ability to leave the tomb and come into the sunlight of the living. The Book of the Dead isn't really a single fixed book, by the way, but rather a compilation of around 190 to 200 spells, from which scribes could pick and choose for a particular person's papyrus. It first appears in writing around the beginning of the New Kingdom, that's 1550 BC, and became extremely popular, being used up through to the Ptolemaic period, that's the 1st century BC. But what's new in the Book of the Dead compared to the coffin texts? Well, firstly, these spells were usually written on papyrus scrolls, which were then placed in the tomb with the mummy, often either in a coffin or a niche. Earlier, in the start of the New Kingdom, some were written on linen shrouds covering the mummy, but papyrus soon became standard. These papyri could be beautifully illustrated with full-color scenes. The famous vignettes of the Book of the Dead that show, for example, the weighing of the heart with Anubis and Thoth present, or the deceased adoring various gods. The spells themselves were partly inherited from the coffin texts and pyramid texts, and partly new compositions. And they do really well at, covering basically everything, from practical help, like the spell for not dying again, which I think is a pretty funny name for a spell, or, get this, the spell for not having to eat feces in the underworld. Yes, there is one. It's certainly a spell that you would definitely want to know. Avoid that situation. Well, there's also lofty hymns, of course, and secret names to use for protection. But perhaps the most celebrated part of the Book of the Dead is spell 125, which describes the weighing of the heart, and includes the negative confession we discussed. You know, I have not done this, I have not done that, So in many papyri, a large vignette shows the deceased's heart being weighed against Mart's feather, with Anubis adjusting and monitoring the scale, Thoth recording the result, and the monster, Amit, waiting to devour yet another failed soul. Meanwhile, the text has the deceased declaring innocence of various sins before the 42 assessors. The spell is like a script for the deceased to follow in the hall of judgment, and a reassurance that if they lived by Mart, they would be able to pass through. It's pretty interesting that this moral element becomes very explicit in the New Kingdom Book of the Dead, because you see the earlier pyramid texts, they were more about the king becoming a star or joining the sun. But by the New Kingdom, even non-royals emphasize justification by morality. It suggests a religious democratization. Anyone, not just the king, well, they all have to prove themselves worthy to Osiris. Other key spells in the Book of the Dead include those for protecting the body. For example, the spell of not letting one's corpse decay in the afterlife, for keeping away snakes or demons in the underworld, for knowing the names of the gates one must pass. There are transformation spells to become a phoenix or even a lotus, a whole bunch of other ones too, and even provisioning spells to ensure one has food, beer, and cool water in the afterlife. Spell 30b, the Heart Scarab spell, is often found inscribed on a scarab amulet placed with the mummy. It implores the heart not to weigh heavy or speak against a person at judgment. Spell 6 is usually inscribed on the small servant figurines called shabtis. It orders the shabti to answer on behalf of the deceased whenever work is demanded in the afterlife, so the shabti does the labor instead of the deceased themselves. It's pretty handy to have a few of them around. Many tombs have dozens or even hundreds of shabti figures with spell 6 written on them to cover all possible days of work in eternity. In other periods, later ones mainly, some tombs included 401 shabtis, one for each day of the year, plus overseers, to ensure the deceased never had to do a day's work in their lives, or rather their deaths. These spells made that system function magically. So the format of the Book of the Dead, well, that varied too. A wealthy person like the scribe Ani, whose Book of the Dead is a famous, richly illustrated papyrus, could afford a large scroll with fine calligraphy and artwork. Others had shorter, less ornate versions. Not every Book of the Dead had all the spells, by the way. They were customized. But certain spells, like number 1, number 15, 125, they were classics. You couldn't go without them, and they were commonly included. In tombs of the New Kingdom, sometimes excerpts from the Book of the Dead were painted on walls or on the mummy's bandages. But we also had other funerary texts. In addition to these three main collections, the Egyptians composed specialized books, especially for royal tombs in the New Kingdom, often called the Books of the Netherworld. These include the Amduat, the Book of what is in the Underworld, the Book of the Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Heavenly Cow, etc. And these were usually reserved for pharaohs, carved and painted on walls of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They map out the hour-by-hour journey of the sun god through the underworld at night, which the pharaoh hoped to accompany. And their imagery is complex, filled with deities, monsters, mystical diagrams. Quite ornate, very complicated. Now, while they are fascinating, these are high-level texts, and not every deceased would use them. They were part of royal knowledge to secure the cosmic regeneration of the king with the sun, so they had to be pretty complicated, not missing on any of the details, of course. Meanwhile, private individuals in the New Kingdom, and later, could have texts like the Book of Breathings, a later derivative of the Book of the Dead, or the Book of Being in the Light, but still the Book of the Dead remained the go-to manual for most people for a very long time. What is crucial to grasp is that Egyptians saw these texts as potent magical apparatus. They weren't just theology, they were practical if you were buried with the right spells, You literally had the cheat sheet to immortality, so you really wanted to get one. You'd know the secret names of the gatekeepers. You'd have the words to command your shabby servants, and you'd have the litany of virtues to recite to the judges. Knowledge was power, and this knowledge was artfully ensconced in the tomb. These texts also have cultural value, don't forget. They're among the finest religious literature of ancient Egypt. They mix prose and poetry, mythology and prayer. For example, in one Coffin text, the deceased says, "I will sail rightly into the sky. I am the one who faces forward," asserting their new-found freedom. Or in the pyramid text, there's an earthly spell where the king's bar is coaxed back to reunite with his body by offering it beer and bread, kind of like luring a cat back home, something like this. It is both poignant and a bit humorous. The bar, depicted as a human-headed bird, needs snacks to be called back home. The overall tone of these texts ranges from confident to triumphant, to occasionally anxious. Some spells are clearly to ward off fears like being hungry or lost in the afterlife. This reveals the humanity behind the beliefs even 4,000 years ago. People feared the unknown after death, and they comforted themselves with scriptures and rituals, much as many cultures do today. So, now that we've prepared the body, performed the rituals, and equipped the deceased with all the magical spells and texts, let's consider the physical context of the burial, the tomb itself, and the goods placed within it. Of course, that's not a one-size-fits-all either, from humble graves to splendors like the Valley of the Kings. Let's take a look at what's inside. So we know that the ancient Egyptians described these tombs as, quote, houses of eternity, and it's a pretty fitting phrase. They built them to last forever. A person's tomb and the goods inside were the material foundation for their afterlife experience. Over Egypt's long history, from all the prehistoric times to the Greco-Roman era, tomb architecture and burial customs evolved dramatically. However, the core ideas remain: provide a secure resting place for the body and equip the deceased with everything they might need or enjoy in the next life. So let's have a look at this more material side of funerary practice, shall we? What the tombs were like, and what was inside, besides the corpse. Well, we'll start with the early burials. Simple. In prehistoric Egypt, before 3100 BC, people were typically buried in small pits in the desert sand. The body was often placed in a fetal position, sometimes wrapped in a mat or an animal skin, and accompanied by a few grave goods, like a pot of food or personal items. Because these graves were shallow and in direct contact with dry sand, the bodies naturally desiccated, creating an accidental mummification, as we noted in the first part of the video. But the goods were minimal, perhaps some beads, a stone tool, or a cosmetic plate in late history. But as time went on, these graves became more elaborate, at least for those who could afford it. By around 3600 BC, some graves included multiple pottery jars, jewelry, figurines, and evidence of some rituals. Certain painted scenes on pottery possibly depict funerary dances. Some corpses were wrapped in linen bandages with resin as early as the late pre-dynastic period. There's also evidence of early experimental mummification. We also see by the first dynasty, that's 3000 BC, thereabouts, that the wealthy started constructing mud brick tombs called mastabas. Well, a mastaba, which is Arabic for bench, named by the archaeologists for their bench-like shape, was a kind of rectangular, flat-roofed tomb structure with inward-sloping sides. Early dynastic elites built mastabas to house their burials, moving beyond simple pits A mastaba typically had an underground burial chamber and a chapel above ground for offerings. These appear in the first and second dynasties. The royal family and nobility at the capital of Memphis, that is, Saqqara and Abydos being the major cemetery sites, all had such tombs, complete with niched walls imitating palaces. The use of coffins also began, initially simple wooden boxes to contain the body, which ironically reduced natural mummification by separating the corpse from the drying sand, so there's that too. But it also necessitated artificial mummification in the long run. So in a roundabout way, it pushed the innovation of that craft. In these early tombs, we also find rich grave goods, from furniture to vessels of food and drink, personal adornments, and even a few precious items. Think of jewelry, stuff like that. A First Dynasty queen's tomb at Abydos actually contained dozens of pieces of jewelry, cosmetic jars, and even a wooden bed. Already, the concept of "you can take it with you" was in full swing, I suppose. Tomb inscriptions from the later periods recall that even in the First Dynasty, people believed that they would use these items in the next life. And then, of course, came the age of the Great Pyramids. The Old Kingdom, especially in the Fourth Dynasty, around 2500 BC. Pharaohs, seeking even grander eternal monuments, built stone pyramids, essentially supersized mastabas with smooth sides converging to a point. The largest, of course, is the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, which originally stood 146 meters tall and was the tallest human-made structure for millennia. Actually, from what I know, the only thing to supersede that was the Eiffel Tower when they built it in Paris, which I believe was in 1895. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, back to the pyramid. And it was indeed a tomb. Inside and out in the heart of a stone mountain lay the king's chamber with a large granite sarcophagus for the pharaoh's coffin. The amount of labor and resources poured into such a tomb, well, one can imagine that that is indeed staggering. Some 2.3 million blocks of stone, weighing a total of 6 million tons, were quarried and assembled for Khufu's pyramid. Surrounding it were smaller pyramids for queens and mastabas for nobles, an entire necropolis. While the pyramids themselves did not contain inscriptions of funerary texts, except the later ones from Unas onward, which did, they were part of a larger complex that did. Each pyramid had a mortuary temple at its base, and a causeway leading to a valley temple. In those temples, offerings were made to the deceased king daily, and relief scenes showed the kings with gods. Now, the entire belief was that the pyramid was a cosmic engine, ensuring the king's ascension to the sky and his eternal reward. Pyramids evolved, but by the 4th century, by the 4th dynasty rather, we have the true pyramids of Giza. Of course, that step pyramid of Djoser is an early form, and we have different styles all throughout. But these newer ones were basically a guarantee of the king's immortality, and by extension, a kind of assertion of his divine power on earth. But for non-royals during the Pyramid Age, they continued to use mastabas and rock-cut tombs, particularly at sites like Giza and Saqqara. Their tomb art often depicted daily life scenes, farming, fowling, banqueting, an innovation that appears in the Old Kingdom, possibly to carry those activities into the afterlife. The grave goods in a noble's tomb, of course, they could be pretty extensive too. Statues of the tomb owner to act as alternative bodies for the car, offering tables, copper tools, linen, food offerings, pretty much anything you could think of. But one common item in many private tombs was a set of beer and bread jars buried for sustenance, and perhaps a slab stela, listing offerings and prayers. Now, back to the Middle Kingdom, which is 2000 to 1700, we see rock-cut tombs proliferate in Upper Egypt, tombs cut into hillsides, with columned halls and painted walls. Pyramids were still built by pharaohs, but smaller, and often of mud brick. They don't survive too well today. For example, Montuhotep II at Deir el-Bahri built a terraced tomb/temple, and later in the 12th dynasty, kings built at Dashur, Lisht, and Hawara. Amenemhat III's pyramid at Hawara included a famed labyrinth, by the way. Pretty cool. The tombs of officials now routinely had coffin texts all over the coffins, and models of daily life. A wonderful example of Middle Kingdom burial goods comes from the tomb of Mekhetre, a high official, circa 1980 BC. When discovered, it contained a trove of wooden models depicting a mini version of his household, cattle being slaughtered, grain being ground, boat sailing, etc., all to ensure that those services were available to him in the afterlife. It shows a belief that replicas could function magically as the real thing. Servant statues, precursors to Shabtis, also appear. Little figurines depicted performing various tasks, intended to come alive for the benefit of the deceased. The early figurines didn't yet have inscribed spells, but they anticipate Shabtis. The richest Middle Kingdom, tombs like those of the nomarchs Beni Hassan or Thebes, included jewelry, weapons, elaborate wooden coffins with inlays, and sometimes even cartonnage masks over the mummy's face. If you're lucky, gilded with gold. And gold, well, that was particularly valued. Not just for its wealth, but for its symbolism. You see, the Egyptians, they said that the gods had flesh of gold, so to adorn a mummy or coffin with gold was to associate it with divinity. In the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070, pharaohs had a bit of a shift. They shifted strategy to avoid the pitfalls of pyramid tombs, which by then were pretty prone to grave robbery. I mean, when you saw a big pyramid on the horizon, you knew that it was full of treasure, right? So they chose the remote Valley of the Kings near Thebes to dig hidden rock-cut tombs for themselves. These tombs were essentially tunnels extending deep into the cliffs, opening into multiple chambers richly decorated with religious texts and images. Notable ones like the Tour of Seti I or Thutmose III are exquisitely decorated with the Amduat and other guides through the night. Though less externally visible than the pyramids, these tombs were still monumental projects. KV5, the largest, likely built for the sons of Ramesses II, has over 100 chambers. Each king still had a separate mortuary temple built elsewhere, like Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri, or the Ramesseum for Ramesses II, where ceremonies were performed, but their bodies rested in the hidden valley to deter thieves. Despite efforts, almost all these royal tombs were robbed in antiquity, perhaps even by some of the necropolis staff themselves. Well, most likely by the necropolis staff themselves, to be honest. However, one sensational exception, I'm sure you know, was the tomb of Tutankhamun, also known as KV62, a relatively small tomb that escaped major looting. When Howard Carter opened it in 1922, he famously saw wonderful things, over 5,000 artifacts piled within. Tutankhamun's grave goods give us a glimpse of the full splendor of a New Kingdom royal burial. Golden shrines, alabaster perfume jars, jewelry, weapons, chariots, even board games, and food as well, even jars of wine labeled by the year and vineyard. but also trivial items like a box of ointment or a stack of loincloths. It was as if every item the young king might use in life or need in death was there, ready to go. Also, he had dozens of Sharply statues. There were 401 Sharplys in his tomb, ready to serve, and protective deity statues guarding him. And, by the way, keep in mind, Tutankhamun, he was a minor pharaoh, not very important. He actually died around the age of 18. So with that in mind, you can only imagine the loot in grander tombs like those of Ramesses II or Amenhotep III, which unfortunately you'll have to keep that in your imagination because they were emptied a long, long time ago. But for non-royals in the New Kingdom, tombs in places like the Valley of the Nobles show a mix of daily life scenes and afterlife scenes. They were typically rock-cut, with an entrance chamber for offerings and a shaft to a burial chamber. Grave goods for nobles included fine coffins, often nested sets of 2 or 3, statues of gods, canopic jars, amulets, cosmetics, clothing, food. Texts from the Book of the Dead were either on papyrus or on the coffin. Stelae with prayers might be set up. Poorer folk might be buried in simple graves outside the formal cemeteries, perhaps wrapped in mats with only a pot or two. Archaeology at sites like Deir el-Medina, the workers' village, found that even ordinary workers managed to secure tombs and modest coffins for themselves. The desire for a proper burial spanned all classes. Now, in later periods, tomb styles shifted again. The late period saw a renaissance of older styles. Many went back to using massive stone sarcophagi with lengthy carved texts, like, for example, the 26th dynasty high official sarcophagi covered in the hieroglyphs and protective images. The number of Sharpties also peaked. Some late period tombs contain hundreds of them, in a nice uniform sets and rows. Mummification in this period became even more elaborate, sometimes with intricate bead net coverings and portrait masks. By the Ptolemaic and Roman eras, we see the beautiful Fayum mummy portraits, realistic painted portraits placed over the faces of mummies, merging Egyptian and Greek art styles, and remarkably, Egyptians were still including the Book of the Dead scrolls and mummifying bodies well into the Roman period. That's the 2nd century AD and beyond. Though by then, the practice was gradually fading. New religions were taking hold. Now, a quick note on the grave goods categories. Across all eras, some common categories of goods can be noted. Food and drink, so we're talking bread, beer, wine, dried meats, and fruits. In fact, in Tutankhamun's tomb there was 30 wine jars, boxes of meat prepared as meals, and baskets of grain. Then we have vessels and furnitures, that is, jars, bowls, plates, chairs, headrests, sometimes litters or chariots as well. We also had symbolic items like amulets, scarabs, other inscribed jewelry that had amuletic or magical function. The royal insignia for kings like crowns, a crook and flail were buried with them. For officials, maybe a staff or seal of office. Ramesses II's queens were buried with their royal scepters. Weapons could be included for protection or status, bows, daggers. Tutankhamun had numerous, including a famous iron meteorite dagger, which is pretty cool. But the Egyptians too expected to enjoy the afterlife, so they included games like senet boards. It's a game kind of like backgammon. They found a lot of them in a lot of tombs. Also musical instruments, writing materials for scribes, and even some reading material. Of course, we also had protective deities and symbols, small statues of images of gods, especially of Osiris, Anubis, Isis, or Horus. The four sons of Horus were represented on canopic equipment, those ones that we mentioned before for the different organs. Some tombs included magic bricks placed in niches of the burial chamber, each brick with a figure or spell to guard one side of the tomb, you see. Tombs were often built during a person's lifetime, you see. For kings, it was a major state project. For officials, an expensive personal project. In life, one might visit their tomb chapel to inspect it. For example, officials in the New Kingdom left inscriptions like, "I made this tomb while I was alive, a place for my memory." But the investment was huge. In the case of the Great Pyramid, not only was it massive in scale, but it was aligned precisely with cardinal points, and incorporated perhaps religious numbers or ideas. Some argue that the slope represents the rays of the sun, or a ramp to the heavens. In the Valley of the Kings, the placement of tombs was thought out so as not to interfere with each other's corridors and possibly hide their entrances. The secrecy became paramount. They might seal a tomb and then conceal the entrance, hoping that robbers would not find it. As history showed, this was partly successful. Tutankhamun's obscurity saved his tomb. Later, when the tomb plundering got out of hand, the priests of the 21st dynasty performed what could be called an ancient reburial project. They collected many New Kingdom royal mummies from their ransacked tombs and reburied them in two sacred caches, one in a shaft at Deir el-Bahri, another in the tomb of Amenhotep II, along with whatever royal coffins and remains of goods that they could salvage. And this ironically preserved those mummies like Ramses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, just to name a few, for discovery in the late 19th century CE. It shows the lengths that Egyptians would go to protect their dead, even centuries after the original burial. Now, it is worth noting, Egyptians tried to dissuade tomb violators spiritually too. Some private tombs in the Old Kingdom bear curses inscribed, warnings to anyone who violate the tomb or disturb the owner's rest, to be punished by a council of gods, or by inversion of fortune, etc. He who shall do any evil or wicked thing to this tomb, may the crocodile be against him in the water, snakes against him on the land, hippopotamus be against him, etc. These inscriptions reflect the fear of losing one's eternal house, and the desperate hope that the gods would sort of guard it for you. Well, from these tombs and goods, we see how funerary beliefs permeated all levels of society. The king demonstrating his divinity and ensuring cosmic order with a pyramid or hidden tomb. The noble associating status and hope for divinity by lavish tombs and goods. Commoners saving what they could to afford a decent burial. Tomb building spurred innovation in architecture and art. The pyramids were marvels of engineering. Tomb paintings within them masterpieces of art. Every little corner was something to marvel at. But it also consumed a big chunk of Egypt's economy. Quarrying all that stone, carving all those sarcophagi, weaving linen for bandages. In fact, one mummy's wrappings could use up to 4 kilometers of linen, not even kidding. The funeral industry employed priests, craftsmen, laborers, and administrators. In the New Kingdom, the village of Deir el-Medina, was entirely occupied by the workers who cut and decorated royal tombs. A highly skilled community that left behind letters and records, giving us a good insight into their daily lives. Certainly helped with this video. Their dedication was such that when their rations were delayed, they directly petitioned officials, as we mentioned in the first labor strike of history. The authorities responded by releasing supplies from the temple. and to gain the state's recognition that the work on the king's tomb was of the highest priority. So, with tombs built and stocked, the Egyptians believed the deceased now had a safe harbor and all the comforts of home for eternity. They often referred to the deceased as enjoying themselves in the field of reeds, plucking lotuses or sitting in cool pavilions in their tomb's vicinity. The tomb goods were expected to magically be available for use. A loaf of bread depicted on the tomb wall or left on an offering table. Well, that was real nourishment for the car. And so, from the simplest grave to the most elaborate tomb, the aim was the same: create a durable place for the dead to live on, furnished with all the luxuries they could get. Physical preparation went hand in hand with spiritual preparations that we've discussed, both required for a successful afterlife. We've focused on the dead, but let's step back and consider how all these customs affected the world of the living in ancient Egypt. Well, the short answer is pervasively. The Egyptian obsession with the afterlife shaped the art, the economy, social structure, even politics. As I might say, Egyptians spent inordinate amount of time on and resources preparing for death, and indeed, Greeks and Romans both remarked on that. But for the Egyptians it was time well spent, an investment in eternity, an expression of deep religious piety and cultural identity. Well, in terms of the economic and labor aspects, building tombs and making funerary goods was a major industry. The state organized huge projects like pyramid construction, which mobilized thousands of workers. Farmers during the flood off-season, skilled stone cutters, haulers, engineers, overseers, everyone. These projects could last decades. In fact, Khufu's pyramid, that lasted 26 years. While sometimes sensationalized as slave labor, it's not exactly the case. Evidence like the workers' cemeteries near Giza suggests that pretty much all of it was a labor tax where workers were housed, fed. We find beer, bread, and beef remains at the workers' village, by the way, and very respected for their contribution. These were artisans, not slaves. The maintenance of the funerary cult of the king in temples attached to pyramids or separate, like in the New Kingdom, employed priests, gardeners to tend orchards for offerings, bakers, brewers, a whole staff to keep delivering the daily offerings. For private tombs, many craftspeople earned livelihoods through commission of coffins, tomb statues, carving inscriptions, weaving burial linens, etc. The famous goldsmiths who made jewelry for the dead, or carpenters who built fine coffins, were effectively servicing the afterlife economy. But even as far away as trade routes, expeditions were sent to get incense from Punt, or cedar wood from Lebanon, partly because these materials were needed for burials, incense for ritual, cedar for coffins and oils, things like this. So of course international trade, well, that had a mortuary driver as well. And then we have political and state ideology. That was of course affected. The pharaoh's legitimacy was tied to his role as a preserver of cosmic order and as an intermediary with the gods, roles that of course extended beyond his life. Building a great tomb was in a way a public demonstration of piety and order. For example, Pharaoh Ramesses III, after defending Egypt from invaders, invested heavily in temple and tomb building, in keeping with the principle of Ma'at, to restore balance to the land. Pharaohs often started their tomb as soon as they took the throne, and the progress of that tomb was a matter of state. In some cases, when a pharaoh died unexpectedly young, like what we see in Tutankhamun, they had to repurpose another tomb because his own was unfinished, which likely caused a bit of a scramble in the administration. Tomb building was so central that its disruption could be a sign of trouble. Late in the New Kingdom, Tomb workers striking due to unpaid wages mirrored the decline of central authority and economic strain. There's a bit of a feedback loop. A prosperous, stable Egypt builds grand tombs. When the state weakens, as at the end of the New Kingdom, tomb security fails, the tomb gets robbed, and the ideology of eternal kingship is shaken. Indeed, after the New Kingdom, pharaohs never quite built tombs on the same scale again, and the practice changed in response to societal shift. A belief in the afterlife also guided how people behaved and treated each other. The prospect of facing the judgment of Osiris and declaring the negative confession, "I've not stolen, not murdered, not lied," etc. Well, that was a moral incentive, because if you had stolen, or if you had murdered, then you had lied also, if you were telling them that you haven't. So don't do it. Many wisdom texts and instructions, as they were called, from Egypt, i.e. the instruction of Taha-Hotep, advise acting with justice and kindness, aligning with Ma'at implicitly, because one's eternal fate depended on it. One Middle Kingdom text, the Dialogue of a Man and His Bar, explores despair and afterlife, showing that some individuals deeply contemplated what comes after death, and that despair could be alleviated by the hope of an honored burial. Of course, the desire to be properly buried meant that family continuity was important. Egyptians valued having children to perform their funerary rites. This likely influenced marriage patterns, birth rates, and how they wrote about family in inscriptions. Ancestor worship was a part of the domestic life. Many households kept busts or stelae of deceased relatives, and would pour libations or make small offerings to them, asking for their guidance or intervention with the gods. Those letters to the dead mentioned they were often written by people who felt wronged or afflicted. They might write to a deceased relative saying something like, "Please intercede and stop all this trouble," or sometimes scolding them for causing a haunting. No one likes being haunted, that's for sure. We have so much in common. Well, there were public religious festivals too that involved the dead. For example, the beautiful Festival of the Valley in Thebes was a yearly event where the living visited the West Bank tombs, bringing offerings and feasting with the dead. Think of it kind of like how we have the Day of the Dead in Mexico. That's the ancient Egyptian version of that. The cult statue of Amun would travel to the West Bank, and families would picnic at tomb sites, sharing food with their departed kin's spirits. So, part of the social calendar included tending to the dead, making it a normal part of life to interface with the afterlife. Additionally, every new moon or specific days like the Feast of Wag were dedicated to commemorating the dead across society. And this means to an ancient Egyptian, caring for one's deceased relatives was as routine as cooking dinner for one's family, or doing the washing, something like this. It required cooking extra bread and beer to bring to the tomb, maybe reciting a few memorized prayers, rather. So, on a philosophical note, the Egyptian approach to death likely gave the living a strong sense of purpose and comfort too. Life was seen as just part of a grand journey, and perhaps that made them more joyful in daily life, knowing that pleasures could be eternal if they did things properly. Herodotus remarked that Egyptians were, in many ways, religious to excess, far beyond any other people, evidenced by their elaborate funerals. But this excess was part of what they made their civilization so distinctive and enduring. It's hard to overstate how much their belief in the afterlife propelled their achievements. If they didn't believe it so much, we wouldn't have those pyramids. And, well, what would Egypt be without the pyramids, right? They built for the ages, and indeed the pyramids still stand. The mummies still fascinate. So in a way they achieved a form of immortality, sure. just not exactly the way that they imagined. So as we conclude our exploration of Egyptian funerary practice, we have to circle back to that fundamental idea that animated all this effort, that life and death were a continuum. Death was just that rite of passage, not an annihilation. Therefore, they approached it with both extreme seriousness and profound hope. They engineered the decay out of death, making corpses everlasting through mummification, the persona everlasting through texts and names, and the memory everlasting through monuments and cult. What emerges is a portrait of a society that, while very much engaged in the practical matters of farming, trading, war, love, and life, always had an eye on eternity. An Egyptian woke up, went about their tasks, but also periodically reminded themselves, am I preparing properly for my death? Have I made my tomb? Have I been virtuous enough so I can prove myself? Have I set aside ointment and linen for my embalming? It was all ingrained. And this did not make them morbid. If anything, it made them optimistic. They greeted death as a transformation, calling the dead Westerners, just as if they moved west a bit, or even the enlightened, as they'd finally reached that state of knowledge. Tomb inscriptions often say, O living who are upon the earth, who pass by this tomb, as you wish to be remembered, pour a libation for me. There's a reciprocity. The dead depend on the living's remembrance, and the living depend on the dead's blessings and example. So in a way, the Egyptian philosophy of death can teach us something universal, to consider our legacy, and to respect those who came before us. They literalize this in extreme form, with those giant pyramids and preserved bodies. But at the heart of it, it's just the human quest for meaning beyond our brief years. The solution was to create a blueprint for immortality, and they followed it with astonishing consistency for thousands of years. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope we can all find inspiration in the Egyptians' reverence for life in this world and the next. And as the Egyptians say, life, prosperity, and health to the living, and eternal sustenance to the deceased. Let's all pour one out for our ancestors. Cheers. And with that, it's certainly been a long video. I told you it would be a long video. You didn't believe me, didn't you? Yes, you did. Well, thank you very much to the top-tier patrons and supporters. We know we love them around here, don't we? Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, the HMS, HH, Crystal, and Tauvery. Thank you so much. And I think it's due now for us to all have a nice little rest. Good night, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, as always, lots of love to you all.